Well, welcome everybody to the Big Picture Manatee. We're really excited this episode. We have a special guest. I'm Cheri Coryea, private business owner, former county administrator with Manatee County, and I'm here with my colleagues.
Hey, Reggie Bellamy, former county commissioner of District 2. Excited to be here.
And I'm Misty Servia, also excited to be here, former county commissioner, and so excited to hear what Damon has to tell us.
Yeah, great. Well, everybody, you can see there's another face on the screen today, and we're really excited to welcome Damon Moore with Oyster River Ecology. And Damon, please share with our audience a little bit about your background, and then we're going to get into some fun questions about what that project that you're working on is all about.
Okay. Well, no, happy to, and I'm really excited to be here. I've worked with all of you in the past, and I've always enjoyed it so much. But so I am a local Manatee kid. Went to grew up in Manatee County. Went to Bayshore High School there. Knew from a really early age that my life was going to kind of revolve around ecology and restoration. I went to school for it in Savannah, Georgia, then quickly came back and started working in the consulting world for Wilson Miller. Did a lot of habitat restoration work and mitigation work when I was there. Actually worked with Betsy Benak. Her and I worked together on some projects when we were at Wilson Miller. I got to a point with that where I was billing almost all of my time to Manatee County government to do restoration design and permitting for things like Perico Preserve and Robinson Preserve. And I loved that part of it. So we eventually, the county found a way to stop paying the consulting rate and pay me a county rate instead, which was great for them because that was a much lower rate, but also it allowed me to work on like my passion projects and really let me kind of reach out and do another part that was really hard to do from the consulting side, which was involve high level of volunteerism and really work with people to bring these cool projects together. So through that, just absolutely amazing opportunities working in the Parks and Natural Resources Department, or just Natural Resources Department under Charlie Hunsicker, for a little over a decade there as a county employee. And I mean, amazing projects that are just like multiple, career defining projects, but I got to do bunches of them. So like all the Perico Preserve and the expansion of Robinson and Ungarelli and the restoration at Tom Bennett and the amazing projects out at Duet. So I've been incredibly lucky. Everything kind of about my work life is devoted to local habitat restoration, and I plan to keep that going until I can't go anymore.
That's great. That's great.
So Damon, thanks for being involved again. And to be honest with you, this is an educational opportunity for me. And I went and looked, on you all's website, and I may have too many questions.
That's okay.
I may have too many questions, but just perusing, there were some conversations about, immediate impact projects and projects that shape our future. And that kind of like, got me like, okay, I want to hear, the impact. And when you talk about oyster restoration, I think we need to know a little bit about, immediate impact projects that you have moving. Can you give us some information on that?
Yeah, so this has kind of been like how I approach all my projects is I want them to be big and impactful, enough to kind of move the needle as far as improving our local habitats, but also get people involved. That was, that's how I was touched by it with volunteer programs when I was, middle school aged. So I feel like, doing this now, I owe it to, bring especially kids involved because they love it. They love the hands-on thing. So, immediate impact is like to be able to, bring them out there, teach them about our local ecology through these experiential projects where, they don't just have somebody, I'm not just like sitting there, blah, 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 this is, these are birds, this is grass, but they do something, they plant something, they install something that the oysters are going to grow on, or they build the units themselves. And that really, it lands, it connects, and then they're a stakeholder in that. That was, for me, it was Lefis Key in the early 1990s when, there was mangrove plantings, and I got drug out there not really knowing what we were going to be doing, But I was, fishing was really important to me at that age. And somebody talked about how, we're going to plant these mangroves and it's great habitat for fish. And for me, I was kind of a restless kid. I needed to be doing something with my hands, and it clicked. So I love, when I see that light bulb go off in those kids' hands, I know like right then, immediate difference. And of all ages, I like awesome programs with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with the Girl Scouts, and when you see them, like maybe we didn't like clear an acre of pepper trees, but the bigger result might be like one of these kids realizing that they can do these things, that there's no, it's not something that's outside of the realm for them to be able to make a difference themselves. So in that regard, there's that instant satisfaction of seeing those light bulbs go off. But honestly, my bigger focus is making those transformational projects move forward. Those take a little bit longer. Like I mentioned with the other ones, like, those like Robinson Preserve and those sorts of things, those take years to put in place. For us, our big one is large scale restoration of oysters in the Manatee River. And it took us a year to get the permits in place to get our first 10 acres ready to go. And then another year to do proof of concept on some new methods that are actually scalable and cost effective so that we can actually attain large scale restoration out there. I can keep, I told you guys, I love talking about this stuff. You could just like say, just talk for 2 hours, Damon, and I would do it. So I'll try to pause if I feel like I'm taking up too much air.
So the Manatee River project was the first project that I learned about. And I think it was when I became a commissioner, and I was out with Charlie Hunsaker, and, he was giving all the new commissioners the tours. And I remember we were out at one of the preserves and you were out there doing a controlled burn. And Charlie, if you know Charlie, whispering in my ear, and he's like, that guy, Damon, like we are so lucky to have him. Gave me your resume over and over again. And that's when I first heard about you. But so I watched the Manatee River Project. We were up in DC advocating for grants and money. I remember for that. And as somebody who grew up on Little Sarasota Bay, I was in Sarasota, grew up there in the same house my whole life. And we used to see these oyster beds out in the middle of Sarasota Bay. And guess what? We had great fishing. We could use the water for boating. I mean, the water was clear. And today it's so different. So I've always thought back about that. Like, what is the relationship after I learned about what you were doing with the bivalves and how they clean the water and how it's really just nature's way of keeping everything balanced. So can you get back to the basics a little bit for our listeners and tell us, how does that work? How do these oysters help improve the water quality?
So oysters are awesome because one way they are, like you said, they're filter feeders. They're drawing water that has sediments and single-celled algae and nutrient. They're pulling that through their body and they're feeding on that. So things like those nutrients that feed those like the harmful algal blooms like red tide that we don't want. Um, Oysters, they help alleviate some of that. They're not the only answer. We can't just plant oysters and say there's going to be no more red tide problems, but they're an important piece of the puzzle there. And it's interesting, like you talk about, there's also like a lot of people like remember when oysters were better and there was better fishing because they are associated with that. And there's tons of studies out there that show those direct impacts to benefits to recreational fishing and commercial fishing. One of the most studied that I find is very interesting, especially like local to Manatee County, is the impact of restoring oyster habitats to commercial blue crab fisheries. And to me, that's important for Manatee County and Manatee River in particular, is because that's one of the only active commercial fisheries that's in there. There's still guys that that are making their living catching blue crabs in the Manatee River. So in the Chesapeake, where there's been large scale restoration projects like this, they see like 150% increase in blue crab catch rates after they do these large scale oyster restoration projects, which makes sense because the blue crab feed on all of those other organisms that are attracted to the reef itself. So all the worms that live in the interstitial space, they'll eat oysters themselves, but oysters they'll close that shell up. But it's addressing the limiting factor of that food availability by providing that habitat where all of these other marine creatures are attracted to. And then and that's just one example. There's so many other ones. Just I love just the biodiversity of these sites. Like if you put on a mask and put your head underwater near a nice mature oyster reef, you don't even have to open your eyes because you can hear it. All the snapping shrimp and grunts of fish compared to like the areas, a lot of them the way they are now, it's just sandy or muddy bottom, and it's the underwater equivalent of a desert. It's just lifeless. So it's, to me, they're called ecosystem engineers because once they get going, they kind of self-reproduce, and the old shells die and the new shells grow on top of them. So they create these awesome intricate habitats in this underwater environment, and they just do so many good things. To me, it's a really important one to restore in our area.
So Damon, this is you really sort of founded your own organization here back in 22, but really not operational, right, until around this time in 2023, so May or so. I mean, so really it's a pretty young organization, but I was looking at the map and all of the different locations that you've impacted so far. What are some of the milestones, that you've reached already just in the early years? And, tell us about what some of the bigger goals are.
So early milestones, obviously one was just to like proof of concept. Can we survive?
Yeah.
We were very fortunate when we started this. I had given a presentation at the Manatee Community Foundation where I got up on the stage and we were talking about environmental things, and I was just fired up about the lack of progress on large scale oyster restoration. So I was like, we need to get out there and start putting this stuff in and take this serious and stop diverting funds to other things. This is a multi-million-dollar project. And I was, approached afterward by one of the gentlemen in the audience and said, have you thought about approaching this project, from a nonprofit? And I was like, I've always had that in the back of my head, never knew where to go with it. So he was with the Charles and Marjorie Brancic Foundation and said, write it up as a proposal, and if it looks like it could stick, he's like, you have a reputation for working on big impactful projects. So I wrote it up, and basically they gave me enough breathing room to get me a year worth of operational funds. If I put myself into it full time, could I start to get grants and build enough momentum to keep it rolling forward? And so far it's been good. I was, in my mind, it was, I'll get out there and I'll get these big multi-million-dollar grants right off the bat. We'll be rolling. And like you said, it's a new nonprofit, and rightfully, like a lot of the organizations, like, right, you've been in existence for 6 months. We're not ready to fire off $1 million to you. So it's been like a lot of smaller grants, but it's been awesome because like through that, like, I've been able to kind of build the foundations together. It gave me time to get the permits in place, which took about a year to do that. Put the, new concepts for how we're doing our oyster restoration. And very importantly, build a volunteer base that, I can start to depend on more and more to help get these things done. And this will be the first time I let anybody know, because I just found out on Friday, is that like we've taken a step up on our grant wins. I found out on Friday that we were awarded just under $300,000 in funding through the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund.
Wow, that's so exciting! Congratulations.
Yeah, it's fun. It's like, it's exciting to get that, but now it's like, okay, like I'm ready to hire some people already anyway. So this is like, okay, now it's really time to get moving now. So we are on the scale up part of this thing too. So
and in the field of grants that you want to be in. I mean, it's
yeah,
amazing to get, the support, especially in the region, because there's a lot of really supportive philanthropy, but that kind of grant that you just mentioned in the world that you need to be able to prove your
yes. And it's a competitive world, and
Yeah.
like, I look at other, I beat out universities and county governments and city governments, and they've seen the work we put into it, and like at this point, I mean, it's about results.
Right.
A lot of these agencies, that we've funded studies for decades. With oysters, we know what needs to be done. We need to move more towards the doing it part, and that's really where my focus is on getting the end result being oysters growing in the water where there weren't before. So I think they're starting to react to that, which is really
Yeah.
exciting.
So congratulations on the grant. Obviously being a part of that nonprofit world, I'm familiar with how challenging that can be, and I'm also familiar with how important volunteers and the actual projects that you do, and people want to see results. And I think results first has a lot to do with one of our other friends here that's very
Oh,
close.
Robin. Everybody knows her in this world. She's awesome.
Right. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about the oyster rag pots when we start talking about projects and things that can actually have, the impact and shape the future. Can you talk a little bit more? Can you talk a little bit about the oyster rag pots projects?
Absolutely. The hardest part is going to be talk a little bit. So, with the large scale oyster restoration stuff that we're pursuing in the Manatee River, first challenge was getting permits for large areas. So we found ways to do that. We've got 10 acres for ourselves. We were able to get 6.5 acres right next to where we're working, dedicated to Manatee County, so they have that option there as well. But it was quickly like, okay, we have the permits. What I started to see really quickly was that when we're talking about 10 acres, the cost to really, like, let me back up just a tiny bit. So when we're doing oyster restoration, we're not getting live oysters and putting them back out there. The larval oysters are ubiquitous in this area. We're just reintroducing that hard material that they need to grow on, because in the Manatee River and really all through Southwest Florida, most of that was harvested and removed from these rivers on a commercial scale for road projects, those sorts of things. So we are just reintroducing that hard material, we call it culch, to these areas. So traditionally, the most cost-effective way to reculch an area in this field of restoration is to reintroduce limestone riprap, this like rocks basically. And a lot of people say, well, why don't you just use oyster shells? And that is an ideal material, but it is not available at scales to be able to do large scale restoration. So most of the large agencies are using riprap rubble. So knowing that's the most cost effective way, you start like, okay, what does it cost to do an acre of that? So an acre of 6-inch thick layer of concrete rubble was upwards of $260,000. So I started like, well, I've got 10 acres I want to do, in the near future, with a long-term goal of 100 acres to meet what was historically in these areas. The math doesn't work. It turns into like New Bridge over the river math. And I love oysters, but I know that to get community support, when we're sitting in traffic, we're going to pay for that bridge before we was like, oh, Damon wants to literally dump innocent rocks in the water, which it's important. But I realized really quickly that we needed to find a more cost-effective way to do this. And that's where oyster rag pots came in, because the materials, it's basically a cotton rag that's hung over a little wood spacer that looks like a coaster with like a metal spike that sticks out the top. So we build them with volunteers. We will end up moving towards building these with staff, because for 10 acres we need 430,000 of them. But and I'll do a quick plug on my website for this. If you go to my website, scroll down, there's a great video that shows how all this, because this is a hard thing to put out there with words. But it makes a little cement pot that uses very little cement, and all the materials to put them together, like all together to make one oyster rag pot, is about $1.05 in materials. And by the time I factor in staff costs to, make them and get them installed, I'm at about $5 a square foot, and traditional methods are over $20 a square foot. So at that point, we can start to really scale these things up. And it's really fun because it has that component where, I've brought these to middle schools. I got a grant from the one of the estuary programs about a year ago that brought me that purchased a trailer that we call Ollie the Oyster trailer, and we take these events to schools, to any group that wants to do these events, which is great because they learn all about oyster ecology and what we're doing with the project. Then they build these, and the ones they build we use for our project. We've installed thousands of them out there already. So it's just an awesome way that's cost effective, scalable, and involves the community in the process to help make them stakeholders in improving our local environment. Wow, that was a very improving our local environment with the people. So, but that is sounded a little cheesy when it came out of my mouth, but it's true. That's why we're doing it.
It is true.
I'm gonna write it down. I like the way that came out though.
So, with all this work that you're doing, and it looks like you have a pretty broad region that you're operating in, how long will it be, or do you have an estimation of when one of your projects will be self-sustaining? How long does it take to build up what you need for it to do what nature does?
Well, it just depends on how you define the project. So my immediate goal for Manatee River is to get the 10 acres I have permitted completely filled out and reculched. When I put one of those oyster pots in, it takes about a year for that to be completely coated with oysters, to the point where when I put them in on 1 foot centers, that they're growing into each other. At that point, I say, there, we have restored reef. It's self-sustaining. The shell will become the new culch material as these other things kind of age out. But the again, 10 acres is big when you're standing out there looking at it, and we're putting these things in at 1 foot centers. That's a lot to do. So knowing that, I don't want this to be something that I do for over 20 years. I really want to scale up. That's the goal for me in the organization, is to prove these concepts out. And then there's a lot of granting agencies that will fund this stuff on the project side because they recognize the value of the ecosystem services that oyster restoration provides. And that doing it this way, which is far more cost effective and has this community involvement aspect, puts me in a very highly competitive place for getting these project grants. So I want to keep doing that. I want to increase staff to manage these sorts of projects. We may end up having to contract some of these things out. That's typically how I did stuff when I was at the county. Obviously, we weren't just picking up shovels. We were getting these big grants in and then finding contractors that could do the work. So we'll do that, but continue to involve a lot of the community with the work. The other direction that I really want to take this to is to eventually have this evolve into like an AmeriCorps work training group. Because as you all know, because you've worked with me a lot over my career, oysters isn't my only trick. I do all sorts of habitat restoration, from upland stuff to wetland stuff. It's tough to, in this field, to find people with early career experience and where they've learned how to identify plants to effectively manage habitat restoration projects on land and employ a lot of these methods. So I'd like to start like a work training, like an AmeriCorps style group, that would, it would help help me implement a lot of these projects, but would also give them early career experience and certifications, proper training, those sorts of things. I went and a month and a half ago or so went up to Apalachicola and met with a group up in the Panhandle called the Florida Corps, and they have a subgroup called Oyster Corps, and they're we were talking about how we could implement something like that in Southwest Florida, because there's currently no opportunities like that in this area. So AmeriCorps funding is a little upside down right now. So we're building out the we're basically building the blueprint that we plan to follow, and hopefully things stabilize and those opportunities return sometime in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you're moving towards potentially adding some folks to help you, because I know how you've had to be everything, and
Yeah.
you are everything, and that's part of the reason why it's so successful. But the more folks you can get involved. So one end of that is fundraising, and probably not something that you love doing, but is part of your organization.
I'm learning how to love it.
And so you have a big event coming up first.
I do.
Yeah,
It's our first ever like formal invite all the people out and celebrate what we're doing event, and I wanted it to kind of be really casual and kind of more on the themes, so we landed on it being called the Oyster Ragpot Shindig. And you saw how hard it is to kind of explain with words how this is. So we're going to, like, all the table centerpieces will be made out of oyster ragpots. We're going to have live demonstrations and a pair of gloves if anybody wants to come and build some for yourselves. But have it like all local, like as like hyper local, like Manatee County seafood with Gully's mullet truck. We're gonna have the St. Pete Boys, like a bluegrassy type band out there. That was the St. Pete Mountain Boys, which I thought is hilarious because St. Pete. But really, it's a good time. It's May 22nd, 5 o'clock at the Palmasola Botanical Park, out there near Robinson Preserve. I couldn't get too far away. I had to stay in my comfort zone. But really, it's going to be a lot of fun. If anybody's interested, we still have a couple of maybe 10 tickets left, because we're getting so close to it. But check out our website. There's obviously other ways to support what we're doing from my website as well. But this will be a recurring event. So if you can't make this shindig, which is called the first ever Ragpot Shindig, we're planning on there being a second. So catch us on the next time around.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And like you said, support for this kind of work is difficult to get. And so we also saw on your website, it's easy to donate, easy to check in to be a volunteer, and see what kind of projects are coming. Before we close out, I want to see if Misty or Reggie have any other questions right now. We know we didn't even scratch the surface of what you're doing, but when that happens to us, we always say, you're going to come back, right?
No, I would love to.
So I don't have any more questions. Just the educational point is understanding the value, of the oyster and the restoration, just thinking about, the erosion control, the shoreline stabilization, some of the stuff I've learned just by looking this up. Obviously, the economic benefits, the power of the oyster is a little bit more powerful than we think.
Yeah.
Just a shout out and a thanks to all that you and your group do, and good luck on May the 22nd. And I'm sure that there's more to come.
Thank you, Damon, for everything that you're doing. And please tell us again how we can find you. What is your web address? And
so the easiest way is, like, you can find me on Google now. If you just Google search Oyster River Ecology, it's www.oysterriverecology.org. But yeah, there's a like, I try to keep that as updated. The other thing too is, like, if you want it like day by day what we're doing, follow our Facebook page and our Instagram pages. And those are, you can just find us searching those on there. And if you can't find those and you really want to, just send me an email, damon@oysterriverecology.org. And by the end of it, I'll have you signed on as a volunteer, but I'll get you the information you want to. And the other thing too, I'll just like throw a quick little thing out there that, like, we didn't get much time to get into, but there is an incredibly interesting and amazing history that surrounds oysters and the Manatee River. I put on a pretty regular presentation about that subject in particular. And it was part of doing the research for the project was to understand what happened to this resource. And it is so fun to deliver because it's just so eye-opening that, so many things around Manatee County and the Manatee River that had to deal with oysters historically from it being originally called the Oyster River, um, on. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. If you have a group and you really like that's down your alley is local history and ecology, shoot me an email. I actually enjoy giving that presentation, so I'm happy to give that to groups too.
That's great to hear because I got one. I'll be reaching out to you.
I like it.
Absolutely.
Yep, let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for our audience. You've learned a little bit about Damon's mission in life, and that he's a local guy, and but he's doing amazing things, incredible ecology, and especially surrounding what's really important here in the Manatee County area and the Gulf Coast. And we thank you for that. So as we close out, we want to remind everybody you can find us on YouTube at the Big Picture Manatee, and also on our website, bigpicturemanatee.com, and on other social media. So stay tuned to future episodes. Sure, Damon's going to be back so he can report to us how things are going. And please send us your questions, messages, reach out to Damon as he's provided all of his information here, to make sure that you're learning as much as you can about what his organization is doing for our local ecology. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time today.